Hey, dish rag!
Petty Officer Braxton Steele's voice exploded across the mess hall like a grenade blast, silencing every conversation. His 6'4" frame cast a shadow over the small woman scrubbing tables, his perfectly pressed Navy working uniform gleaming with arrogant authority. "What's your rank, sweetheart? Cleaning lady first class?" 12 Navy SEALs abandoned their breakfast trays, phones whipping out like weapons to capture fresh prey. The mess hall transformed into a coliseum, steam rising from forgotten coffee as the scent of testosterone and cruelty thickened the air. This was blood sport disguised as breakfast entertainment. Saren Blackthorne kept her piercing blue eyes downward, blonde curls escaping her high bun as she methodically cleaned around their boots. Her faded gray t-shirt concealed both the mysterious dog tag that burned against her chest and the angular diamond tattoo marking her as property of ghosts. 24 months, 18 days of invisibility. 24 months of swallowing the taste of betrayal every morning in this exact spot where she once sat as an honored warrior. But they couldn't see the predator breathing beneath the prey's disguise. How her shoulders maintained perfect military alignment despite the psychological assault. How her cleaning cloth moved with the same lethal precision she once used to dismantle enemy weapons in complete darkness. How her peripheral vision had already cataloged every exit, every improvised weapon, every weakness in their formation. In exactly 11 minutes, that gray t-shirt would tear during a perfectly orchestrated accident. In exactly 11 minutes, the most decorated cleaning lady in military history would remind everyone present why legends never truly die. They just wait for the perfect moment to rise from the ashes and reclaim their throne. The countdown had begun, and Braxton Steele had just lit the fuse on his own destruction. The morning California sun streamed through steel-framed windows, casting long shadows across polished linoleum as Braxton circled his prey like a shark sensing blood in the water. His crew of elite operators formed a loose semicircle around Saren's table, their tactical boots clicking against the floor with predatory synchronization. The breakfast crowd had swelled to nearly 60 personnel, all drawn by the magnetic pull of impending humiliation. "Look at this, boys," Braxton announced, his voice pitched perfectly to carry across the expanding audience. "We got ourselves a ghost, just floating around our sacred space, invisible as smoke." He leaned closer to Saren, his breath hot against her ear. "But ghosts don't belong in the land of the living, do they, sweetheart?" Serene's cleaning cloth continued its methodical circles, never missing a beat. Her movements possessed an economy of motion that spoke of muscle memory, forged in circumstances far removed from mess hall maintenance. She didn't flinch when Braxton's shadow fell across her work, didn't react when his voice dropped to a menacing whisper. Instead, she simply shifted her weight with fluid precision, maintaining perfect balance on the balls of her feet. The subtle adjustment caught the attention of Knox Ryder, a weapons specialist whose trained eye recognized the stance of someone ready to move in any direction at a moment's notice. Knox pushed back from his table, his interest piqued by details that didn't add up. At 32, he'd spent enough years evaluating personnel to know when someone was playing a role that didn't quite fit. "Steele," Knox called out, his voice cutting through the building excitement. "Maybe ease up a bit. Some of us are trying to eat." But Braxton was riding the wave of adrenaline and attention, his ego feeding on the crowd's energy. "Nah, Ryder, this is important. We can't have unauthorized personnel wandering around our facility without proper vetting." He turned back to Saren, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "So what do you say, princess? Ready to show us some identification? Prove you belong here among real warriors?" The dog tag beneath Saren's shirt felt like it was burning against her skin. The metal chain had worn a groove in her neck over the months, a constant reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd become. The symbols etched into its surface told a story that no one in this room was cleared to read. A ghost story written in classified ink. Quick question before this story explodes. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I'm curious how many nations are about to witness this legendary moment unfold. Dope. Meredith Caldwell observed the developing situation from her position at the coffee station, her trained eye documenting micro-expressions and behavioral patterns with the detached precision of a scientist studying specimens. At 45, she'd built her reputation on reading the psychological profiles of military personnel, but the woman at the center of this harassment displayed markers that defied conventional categorization. The subject's breathing remained controlled, despite obvious stress indicators. Her posture suggested extensive physical conditioning, masked by deliberately slouched shoulders. Most intriguingly, her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to working under pressure. Real pressure, not the manufactured drama of mess hall politics. Dr. Caldwell made subtle notes on her phone, documenting the shift from general harassment to something more focused and potentially revealing. The psychological dynamics were evolving in ways that suggested multiple participants had agendas beyond simple bullying. Seaman Davis, 19 years old and still new enough to the Navy to believe in honor and respect, watched from the serving line with growing discomfort. He'd seen this scene play out before, confident operators using their status to humiliate anyone they perceived as beneath their elevated position. But something about this particular target reminded him of his own grandmother, a proud woman who had served in Korea and never spoke about what she'd endured. The mess hall's radio system crackled with morning chatter, routine communications that provided background noise to the unfolding drama. Seren's head lifted almost imperceptibly at the sound, her attention drawn to frequencies and protocols that most civilians would find meaningless. Her fingers paused in their cleaning rhythm for exactly 2 seconds before resuming their methodical pattern. Knox Ryder noticed the pause. His weapons specialist training had taught him to catalog details that others missed, and the woman's reaction to radio traffic suggested familiarity with military communication systems. He pushed his chair back and approached the confrontation with renewed interest. "Mind if I ask what brings you to Coronado?" Knox's tone was conversational, but his eyes were calculating. "You seem familiar with the environment?" Seren looked up for the first time, her blue eyes meeting Knox's with steady directness. "I work here," she said simply, her voice carrying an undertone of authority that seemed incongruous with her apparent position. "Work here doing what exactly?" Braxton interjected, unwilling to let Knox hijack his moment of dominance. "Because last I checked, we don't contract janitors who look like they belong at a homeless shelter." The cruel laughter from his crew provided the soundtrack Braxton was looking for, but Knox remained focused on details that painted a different picture. The woman's hands, visible now as she adjusted her grip on the cleaning cloth, bore calluses and patterns he recognized. These weren't the soft hands of someone whose most dangerous job involved mopping floors. Master Chief Wade Vance entered the mess hall through the main doors, his weathered presence immediately commanding attention from every military person in the room. At 58, he carried the bearing of someone who'd earned respect through proven performance in multiple theaters of operation. His entrance created a momentary pause in conversations throughout the facility as personnel recognized the approach of unquestioned authority. But instead of addressing the obvious confrontation developing around Seren's table, Master Chief Vance headed toward the coffee station where Dr. Caldwell continued her observations. His movement suggested awareness of her presence and purpose, indicating coordination between multiple levels of authority in monitoring the situation. "Morning, Doctor," he said quietly, acknowledging her evaluation role without drawing attention from the gathered crowd. "Master Chief," she replied with professional courtesy. Interesting social dynamics developing this morning. Their brief exchange confirmed that the confrontation was under official observation, though the nature and purpose remained unclear to the participants. Knox caught the interaction in his peripheral vision, adding another layer to his growing suspicion that events were unfolding according to some larger design. Seren returned her attention to the table surface, but her awareness expanded to include every detail of the room's changing dynamics. The arrival of senior authority represented either opportunity or additional threat, depending on factors she couldn't yet determine. Her survival instincts, honed during 72 hours of hell in enemy territory, automatically cataloged options and exit strategies. The memory surfaced without warning, darkness thick as blood, the weight of 6 dead teammates around her, and the distant sound of enemy patrols growing closer. She'd learned to clean weapons in complete silence during those endless hours, fingers moving by touch alone, while her mind calculated angles of escape and fields of fire. "You know what I think?" Braxton's voice cut through the siege flashback like a blade. "I think our little ghost here is hiding something that doesn't belong in a place of honor like this." He reached across the table and deliberately knocked over his coffee cup, sending liquid cascading across the surface Seren had just finished cleaning. The action was obviously deliberate, a test of her reaction to sabotage and provocation, designed to humiliate her in front of the growing audience. Serene's response was to calmly retrieve additional cleaning supplies and begin addressing the mess without comment or complaint. Her movements remained controlled and efficient, showing no signs of frustration or anger at having her work deliberately undone. But Knox noticed the slight tremor in her left hand. Not fear, but something deeper and more complex. "That's not normal," Knox muttered to himself, his weapons specialist training, interpreting body language that told stories most people couldn't read. The tremor pattern suggested trauma response, the kind developed by personnel who'd experienced situations where showing weakness meant death. Advanced military communication systems use sophisticated encryption protocols developed for special operations. These enterprise-level security solutions ensure sensitive conversations remain completely protected for professionals requiring maximum confidentiality. The crowd around Serene's table had grown to include nearly 20 personnel, their phones capturing every moment of what they assumed would be another routine humiliation of civilian staff. Steam continued to rise from abandoned breakfast trays, while the scent of coffee mixed with increasing tension in the confined space. Braxton fed off the energy like a performer working his audience. "See how she takes it? No fight, no spirit. That's what happens when you don't belong somewhere. You learn to accept whatever gets thrown at you." He gestured dismissively at Serene's methodical cleaning. "Probably grateful for the work. Probably grateful someone like me even acknowledges her existence." But Knox was studying details that contradicted Braxton's narrative. The woman's knife work while cutting fruit earlier had displayed precision that spoke of advanced training. Her familiarity with radio protocols suggested technical knowledge beyond civilian maintenance backgrounds. Most significantly, her physical conditioning was evident despite efforts to conceal it beneath loose clothing. "Mind showing me how you hold that knife when you're working?" Knox asked, his tone casual but his attention focused. "I noticed your technique earlier. Pretty precise for food prep." Serene paused in her cleaning, her blue eyes assessing Knox with the calculating attention of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. She reached for the paring knife she'd used earlier, her fingers finding the grip with automatic precision that made Knox's suspicions crystallize into certainty. The blade moved in her hands like an extension of her nervous system, cutting an apple with surgical precision that left the fruit divided into perfect uniform sections. Knox watched the demonstration with professional attention, noting details that confirmed his growing conviction about her background. "That's not food prep," he said with certainty, his voice carrying enough authority to draw additional attention from nearby tables. "That's tactical blade work. Where did you get training like that?" Before Serene could respond, the mess hall's communication system crackled to life with an equipment malfunction that created static and interference across multiple frequencies. The technical problem disrupted communications throughout the facility, but Serene's reaction suggested knowledge that went far beyond civilian familiarity with military radio systems. Without conscious thought, her hand moved toward the radio controls with the automatic precision of someone who had spent countless hours managing communication equipment under combat conditions. She caught herself before completing the movement, but Knox had already registered the aborted action. "Interesting," he murmured, his eyes narrowing with professional interest. "Very interesting indeed. Your gut instinct about Serene is probably screaming right to you. Share your theories below. What do you think she's really hiding?" The radio static triggered another unwanted memory, dragging Serene back to a mountainside in Afghanistan where everything had gone wrong. She'd been monitoring enemy communications when Colonel Thorne's voice had cut through the chatter, with words that would destroy her life. "Phoenix is compromised. Eliminate her with the rest." The betrayal had come from the one person she'd trusted completely, the mentor who'd shaped her from a raw recruit into the elite operative known as Silver Phoenix. 24 hours later, she'd been alone in hostile territory, with 6 dead teammates and the crushing knowledge that her father figure had sold them out to save his own corrupt empire. "You okay there, sweetheart?" Braxton's voice dragged her back to the present, his tone mocking the distant look that had crossed her features. "Looking a little spacey. Maybe this job is too challenging for someone of your limited capabilities." Serene blinked, her focus returning to the immediate threat as training reasserted control over emotion. She had learned it during those 72 hours of hell that survival required absolute presence in the moment, regardless of what ghosts demanded attention. "I'm fine," she said simply, her voice carrying undertones that made several personnel unconsciously straighten their postures. Knox caught the subtle shift in her tone, the way authority bled through despite obvious efforts to remain invisible. He'd heard that particular quality before, in the voices of operators who had seen real combat and learned to command through competence rather than rank. "Look, I'm not trying to hassle you," Knox said, his approach more respectful than the harassment she'd been receiving. "But I've seen a lot of blade work in my job, and what you just demonstrated looked like military training. I'm curious about your background." Dr. Caldwell documented the shift from general harassment to specific questioning about skills and background. The psychological dynamics were evolving in ways that suggested the confrontation might reveal information that none of the participants expected. Her notes included observations about the subject's controlled responses under increasing pressure and the emergence of technical capabilities that contradicted her apparent civilian status. Seren picked up the paring knife again, this time with deliberate precision that made her earlier demonstration look casual. The blade moved through the air in patterns that spoke of training conducted under conditions far removed from kitchen safety, cutting techniques designed for efficiency rather than presentation. "Where did you serve?" Knox asked directly, his weapons specialist credentials giving weight to his assessment. "Because that's not civilian knife handling." The question hung in the air like a challenge, drawing attention from personnel throughout the mess hall who sensed the conversation had shifted into territory with potential consequences. Phones remained focused on the developing confrontation, but the energy had changed from entertainment to something more serious. Seren met Knox's gaze with steady directness, her blue eyes holding depths that suggested experiences most people couldn't imagine. "I've had various assignments that require different skill sets," she said carefully, providing acknowledgement without specific information. The response pattern itself was indicative of training and information security protocols, a way of answering questions without revealing classified details. Knox recognized the technique from his own experience with personnel operating under various levels of security clearance. "Various assignments," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to describe a resume, mind being more specific." But Braxton wasn't interested in Knox's methodical investigation. The weapons specialist was stealing his thunder, turning what should have been simple humiliation into something resembling an actual interview. "Holy cow, Ryder, you sound like you're recruiting her for something. She's a janitor, not a candidate for special operations." The dismissive comment triggered a subtle shift in Serene's expression, a micro-expression that Dr. Caldwell documented as significant. The subject's reaction suggested personal experience with special operations that went beyond general familiarity with military terminology. Knox noticed the same reaction, adding it to his growing collection of evidence that the woman in front of him was operating far below her actual capability level. Her physical conditioning, technical knowledge, and behavioral patterns all suggested background in specialized military training. "You know what?" Knox said, his tone shifting toward genuine curiosity rather than harassment. "I've got years of weapons specialist training, and what I've seen this morning doesn't add up. You've got tactical blade skills, military radio expertise, and physical conditioning that suggests serious training. That's not the background of someone doing general maintenance work." The summary was accurate and demonstrated legitimate professional concerns about personnel operating outside their supposed qualifications. Knox's approach had been inappropriate initially, but his observations had identified genuine discrepancies that warranted explanation. Master Chief Vance stepped forward from his position near the coffee station, his decades of experience recognizing that the confrontation had reached a point where senior oversight was necessary to prevent potential problems for all involved. "That's enough," Master Chief Vance announced with authority that immediately commanded attention from every person in the mess hall. "This assessment has gone beyond appropriate parameters for routine interaction with civilian personnel." His intervention represented recognition that the harassment had crossed professional boundaries and required command-level attention to prevent escalation into more serious problems. But Knox wasn't ready to abandon his investigation. His weapons specialist instincts convinced that security concerns warranted continued evaluation. "Master Chief, with respect, we've identified legitimate security concerns that warrant evaluation," Knox persisted, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who believed duty required him to pursue potential threats. "This person has capabilities that don't match her supposed background, and her clearance level appears to exceed standard civilian contractor parameters. Military personnel facing career challenges need comprehensive financial protection and strategic investment planning. Professional advisors specializing in military transitions provide stability during uncertain times while building long-term wealth. The mess hall had become a pressure cooker of competing agendas and escalating tension. Dr. Caldwell continued documenting behavioral patterns while Master Chief Vance evaluated the need for command intervention. Knox remained focused on security concerns that his training demanded he pursue. Braxton fed off the crowd's energy, while Seren maintained the controlled stillness of someone accustomed to surviving in hostile environments. The convergence of forces created a moment of perfect instability, a situation balanced on the edge of revelation or disaster. Seren felt the familiar weight of the dog tag against her chest, its metal surface warm from contact with skin that bore scars most people couldn't imagine. 24 months, 18 days since the court-martial that had destroyed her life, based on testimony from the one person she'd trusted completely. Colonel Marcus Thorne had looked her in the eye and sworn under oath that Silver Phoenix had betrayed her team, sold classified information to enemy forces, and caused the deaths of 6 elite operators. The lies had been masterfully constructed, supported by forged documents, and planted evidence that painted her as a traitor rather than the sole survivor of Thorne's conspiracy. She'd sat in that courtroom and watched her mentor destroy her reputation with the same methodical precision he'd once used to build her into an elite warrior. "These aren't maintenance workers' hands," Knox announced to the gathered crowd, drawing attention to callous patterns and scarring that told stories of extensive weapons training. "These are combat hands. Look at the scarring, the conditioning. This woman has extensive military experience." His observation drew murmurs from personnel throughout the mess hall as word spread that the harassment target might not be what she appeared. The gathering crowd created increased pressure for Seren to explain discrepancies between her apparent role and her demonstrated capabilities. But explanations required revelations she wasn't prepared to make, secrets that could endanger operations still running in classified theaters. The dog tag around her neck carried access codes that had been revoked but not erased, symbols that would identify her to anyone with appropriate clearance levels. Holy cow, that tension is about to shatter. Drop your predictions. What happens when that shirt tears and reveals her secret? The moment of truth arrived with deceptive casualness. Braxton, frustrated by Knox's methodical investigation and the loss of his dominant position in the confrontation, decided to reassert control through physical intimidation. He reached across the table with deliberate aggression, his massive hand closing around Seren's wrist with enough force to leave marks. "I think we're done playing games," he growled, his voice dropping to the menacing tone he'd perfected during years of psychological operations. "You're coming with me for a more private conversation about your qualifications." The grab triggered something primal in Seren's nervous system, muscle memory forged during 72 hours of survival training that had become 72 hours of actual survival. Her body reacted before conscious thought could intervene, every instinct screaming warnings about physical restraint and the need to escape. But instead of the explosive response her training demanded, she forced herself to remain still. The control required was enormous, fighting against every survival instinct while maintaining the facade of helplessness that had kept her invisible for 24 months. The effort of restraint caused a tremor to run through her entire body, a physical manifestation of the war between trained response and conscious control. Knox noticed the tremor and recognized it as something far more complex than simple fear. "Steal," Master Chief Vance commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform. "Release her immediately. This stops now." But Braxton was too deep in his performance to recognize the danger signals that more experienced personnel were beginning to read in Seren's posture. His grip tightened as he attempted to force her to stand, his ego unable to accept anything less than complete dominance over what he perceived as a helpless target. The physical pressure triggered the worst of Seren's memories. Thorne's hands around her throat during what he had called a debriefing session, his voice soft and reasonable, while his grip promised death if she didn't accept the blame for his crimes. "You'll take the fall," Thorne had whispered, his breath hot against her ear, "or I'll finish what the enemy started in those mountains." The flashback lasted only seconds, but it was enough to shift Seren's body chemistry into combat readiness. Her breathing deepened, her vision sharpened, and every muscle fiber prepared for the kind of violence that had kept her alive when 6 elite operators had died around her. Knox saw the change and recognized it immediately. This wasn't fear or submission, this was a predator preparing to strike with lethal efficiency. His weapons specialist training screamed warnings about imminent explosive violence from someone whose capabilities he was only beginning to understand. "Steele, back off," Knox commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. "Back off right now." But Braxton misread the situation completely. The stillness he perceived as surrender was actually the calm before a storm that could destroy everything in its path. His grip shifted to her shoulder, trying to force her into compliance through escalating physical dominance. The motion tore her gray t-shirt at the shoulder seam, revealing pale skin marked by scars that told stories of violence survived and victories earned through blood. But it was the tattoo that made Knox's breath catch in his throat, an angular diamond with a central eye, exactly matching symbols he'd seen in classified briefings about operations he wasn't cleared to discuss. The revelation lasted only a moment before Seren's hand moved to cover the exposed marking, but it was enough. Knox's weapons specialist clearance included familiarity with unit insignias that most personnel would never see, symbols reserved for operations that didn't officially exist. "Holy cow," someone whispered from the crowd, the words carrying clearly in the suddenly silent mess hall. The dog tag had swung free during the struggle, its metal surface catching fluorescent light and revealing symbols that made Dr. Caldwell's psychological evaluation suddenly irrelevant. Whatever classified history this woman carried, it was far beyond the scope of routine personnel assessment. Knox stared at the partially revealed tattoo with growing recognition, his mind racing through classified briefings and operational histories that painted an impossible picture. The symbols weren't random military artwork. They were specific identifiers for units that operated in the darkest corners of national security. Master Chief Vance's expression shifted from command authority to something approaching reverence, as he recognized markings he'd seen only in the most classified operational reports. His 3 decades of service had included enough exposure to special operations to understand when he was in the presence of someone whose service record would never appear in official databases. "Everyone back," Master Chief Vance commanded, his voice carrying new urgency. "Clear the area immediately." But the damage was done. Phones throughout the mess hall had captured the moment of revelation, the torn shirt and exposed tattoo, now documented in digital images that would spread far beyond the confines of Coronado Naval Base. Seren felt 24 months of carefully constructed invisibility crumbling around her, the persona she'd built to survive her exile dissolving under the weight of recognition. The dog tag against her chest felt like a beacon, its revoked access codes suddenly relevant again in ways that would complicate everything she'd worked to rebuild. The angular diamond tattoo marked her as property of ghosts, a member of units that didn't exist in any official capacity. The single teardrop she'd added after the betrayal told its own story of loss and survival, marking her as both warrior and victim in conflicts that would never appear in history books. Knox's recognition was complete now, his weapons specialist clearance enough to understand the significance of symbols that marked her as either the most dangerous person in the room or the most wronged. His mind raced through implications and possibilities, trying to reconcile the woman cleaning tables with the elite operative whose identity was slowly emerging from careful concealment. Dr. Caldwell's psychological evaluation had suddenly become irrelevant in the face of security concerns that went far beyond routine personnel assessment. Her documentation of behavioral patterns and stress responses now painted a picture of someone operating under constraints that had nothing to do with civilian employment and everything to do with classified operations that continued even after official termination. The mess hall had become a focal point for converging interests and conflicting agendas, with Seren at the center of a revelation that would change everything for everyone present. 24 months of exile and anonymity were ending in exactly the way she'd feared most, with recognition that would force choices she wasn't prepared to make. The countdown Braxton had unknowingly started was reaching 0, and the most decorated cleaning lady in military history was about to remind everyone present that some legends never truly die. They just wait for the perfect moment to reclaim their rightful place in the Warriors' Hall. The silence stretched across the mess hall like a held breath, broken only by the soft electronic sounds of phones recording a moment that would define careers and change lives. In exactly 30 seconds, Commander Cross would burst through the main doors with news that would validate everything Knox suspected and destroy everything Braxton believed about Porter and position. But for now, in this perfect moment of suspended time, Saren Blackthorne stood with her secret partially exposed, the ghost of Silver Phoenix stirring to life after 24 months of carefully maintained death. The revelation rippled through the mess hall like shockwaves from an explosion, each witness processing the impossible convergence of symbols they'd glimpsed and stories they'd been told. Braxton's face drained of color as the implications settled into his consciousness, his confident aggression dissolving into the pale uncertainty of someone who'd just discovered he'd been torturing a war hero. Knox stepped forward with the reverence reserved for legends, his weapons specialist training finally providing context for observations that hadn't made sense. The calloused hands, the tactical knife skills, the radio expertise, all pieces of a puzzle that revealed someone operating so far below her actual capability that the deception itself spoke of classified necessity. "Silver Phoenix," Knox whispered, the words carrying weight that made nearby personnel unconsciously straighten their postures. Dr. Caldwell's professional facade cracked as her psychological evaluation collided with security realities far beyond her clearance level. The behavioral patterns she documented weren't symptoms of civilian stress. They were the controlled responses of someone managing trauma acquired in theaters of operation that didn't appear on any official maps. Seaman Davis pushed forward through the crowd, his young face bright with recognition and something approaching awe. "She's one of us," he breathed, the words carrying across the silent mess hall like a prayer. Master Chief Vance stood at rigid attention, his 3 decades of service providing enough context to understand that he was witnessing the return of someone whose sacrifice had been written in classified ink and whose service would never appear in official histories. The phones remained focused on Saren's partially exposed tattoo, capturing the angular diamond and central eye that marked her as belonging to operations that existed in the shadow spaces between official policy and necessary action. The single teardrop edition told its own story of loss and betrayal, visible evidence of wounds that went deeper than any physical scarring. Braxton staggered backward, his voice reduced to stammering denials of reality too large for his ego to process. "This can't be right. She's nobody, she's nothing." But the evidence was undeniable, written in symbols that spoke to those with eyes trained to read the stories that mattered most. Saren Blackthorne had been hiding in plain sight, maintaining anonymity through 24 months of invisible service while carrying secrets that could reshape understanding of operations conducted in humanity's darkest hours. The mess hall doors burst open with explosive force, admitting figures whose presence would transform whispered recognition into official validation. The countdown that had started with Braxton's cruel mockery was reaching zero, and the ghost known as Silver Phoenix was about to discover that some legends are too important to remain buried forever. 24 months, 18 days of exile were ending in exactly the way fate had always intended, with truth emerging from shadow and honor, reclaiming its rightful voice in the halls where warriors gather, to remember those who serve in silence and sacrificial in darkness. The reckoning had begun. The silence that followed Knox's whispered recognition stretched across the mess hall like a death shroud. Every breath held in collective anticipation of consequences none of them could fully comprehend. 63 personnel stood frozen in a tableau of shock and revelation, their phones capturing images that would reshape careers and redefine understanding of what it meant to serve in the shadows. Braxton's face cycled through expression sins like a broken neon sign. Confusion, denial, fear, and finally a pale recognition that his world had just shifted on its axis. His massive frame, which had seemed so imposing moments earlier, now appeared diminished against the growing weight of implications he couldn't escape. "This is impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. "She's nobody. She cleans tables. She's nothing." But Knox was studying the exposed tattoo with the intensity of someone decoding a message written in blood and classified ink. The angular diamond with its central eye matched symbols from briefings so classified that acknowledging their existence required security clearances most personnel would never achieve. "The teardrop," Knox whispered, his weapons specialist training allowing him to read the modification that transformed the original design into something far more personal. That's post-operational trauma marking, someone who survived when their team didn't. Caldwell's psychological evaluation had become irrelevant in seconds, replaced by security concerns that went beyond her expertise and clearance level. The behavioral patterns she'd documented weren't civilian stress responses. They were the controlled reactions of someone managing trauma acquired in operations that didn't officially exist. The dog tag continued to catch fluorescent light as it swayed against Saren's chest, its metal surface revealing symbols that made Master Chief Vance's 3 decades of service suddenly feel inadequate. He'd seen enough classified operations to recognize markings reserved for units that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. "Ghost Unit 7, Master Chief Vance breathed, his voice carrying reverence reserved for legends. "Silver Phoenix." The name rippled through the crowd like electricity, sparking recognition in personnel whose clearance levels provided context for stories told in whispers and speculation. Silver Phoenix wasn't just a call sign, it was a legend, a ghost story that lived in the classified margins of special operations folklore. Seaman Davis pushed through the gathering crowd, his young face bright with something approaching worship. The 19-year-old had heard fragments of the Phoenix story during advanced training, rumors about an operator whose capabilities exceeded human limitations and whose sacrifice had been written in ink too dark for official recognition. "You're her," Davis whispered, his voice carrying across the silent mess hall. "You're the one who held Firebase Delta for 18 hours. You're the one who saved 200 Marines." The reference hit Seren like a physical impact, dragging her back to memories she'd spent 24 months trying to bury. Firebase Delta had been her first major operation under Colonel Thorne's command, a mission that had established her reputation and sealed her fate as his most trusted protege. She'd held that position for 18 hours against impossible odds, calling in artillery strikes on her own location while coordinating evacuations that saved lives at the cost of everything she'd thought she understood about honor and duty. The mission had been perfect, until Thorne had used her success to justify operations that crossed lines she'd never imagined existed. "That was classified," Seren said quietly, her voice carrying undertones that made several personnel unconsciously step backward. But the damage was spreading beyond control, recognition cascading through the crowd, as pieces of legend aligned with the woman standing before them. The Silver Phoenix stories had circulated through special operations communities for years, whispering accounts of impossible missions and superhuman capabilities that most had assumed were exaggerated mythology. Knox's weapons specialist training provided enough context to understand that mythology often contained more truth than official histories. The woman who had been cleaning tables for 24 months had capabilities that went far beyond anything civilian contractor databases could explain. The mess hall doors exploded open with force that made everyone jump, the impact of metal against concrete walls echoing like gunshots through the confined space. Commander Ethan Cross stood framed in the doorway, his weathered features showing strain that spoke of urgent circumstances and classified emergencies. Behind him came 2 Marines in full-dress uniform, their presence adding military formality to what had been mess hall entertainment. The sudden appearance of senior authority transformed the atmosphere from revelation to official intervention, suggesting forces beyond their understanding had been monitoring events. Commander Cross's eyes swept the gathered crowd before settling on Seren with recognition that was immediate and profound. His expression shifted through phases: surprise, concern, and finally determination that suggested predetermined courses of action. "All personnel except designated individuals will clear this space immediately," Commander Cross commanded, his authority absolute and unquestionable. "This area is now under security protocols that require immediate compliance." The crowd began dispersing reluctantly, their phones still recording, until Marines stepped forward with gestures that made continued filming inadvisable. Within 90 seconds, the mess hall had been reduced to essential personnel whose clearance levels qualified them for whatever revelation was about to unfold. Braxton remained frozen at the center of the emptying space, his confident aggression replaced by the pale uncertainty of someone who'd just discovered the magnitude of his mistake. His career-ending error was becoming visible in real time, as authority figures who outranked him by decades took control of the situation. Knox held his position with the determination of someone whose weapons specialist training demanded he understand the full scope of what he'd uncovered. His security concerns had evolved from routine personnel verification to classified territory that could reshape his understanding of operations he'd thought he understood. Dr. Caldwell documented the dramatic shift in authority and environment, her psychological training recognizing power dynamics that went far beyond routine military hierarchy. The situation had moved into classified territory that made her civilian consultant status suddenly relevant in ways she hadn't anticipated. Master Chief Vance stood at attention with the bearing of someone whose 3 decades of service had prepared him for moments when legends emerged from shadow to reclaim their rightful recognition. His position between civilian authority and military necessity made him essential to whatever resolution was developing. Seaman Davis remained at the periphery with the wide-eyed attention of someone witnessing history in the making. His youth and idealism provided context for understanding how legends affected the people they were designed to inspire. Commander Cross approached Seren with steps that carried the weight of classified knowledge and unavoidable decisions. His movement was deliberate, respectful, and tinged with something that might have been regret for circumstances that had brought them to this moment. "Phoenix," he said simply, the single word carrying recognition that validated everything Knox had suspected and destroyed everything Braxton had assumed. If this story just gave you chills about justice and redemption, smash that like button, hit thanks to support more incredible tales, and subscribe for stories that change everything. Seren looked up at Commander Cross with eyes that held depths most people couldn't imagine. Experiences written in classified ink and sealed with blood, spilled in operations that would never appear in official histories. 24 months of carefully maintained anonymity were dissolving under recognition that felt both inevitable and unwelcome. "Commander," she replied, her voice carrying undertones of authority that made it clear why she'd once been considered among the most elite operators in Special Forces history. "You're cleared for return," Commander Cross continued, his words carrying implications that reached far beyond simple reinstatement. "Colonel Thorne was arrested 6 hours ago. The conspiracy charges have been substantiated through evidence that clears you completely." The revelation hit the remaining personnel like physical impact, reshaping their understanding of events they'd witnessed and stories they'd heard. Braxton's face went from pale uncertainty to ashen recognition as implications cascaded through his consciousness like falling dominoes. Knox's weapons specialist training provided enough context to understand that conspiracy charges against senior officers involved classified operations with consequences that could reshape entire theaters of conflict. The woman he'd been investigating wasn't just another veteran. She was someone whose sacrifice had protected operations most people would never know existed. Dr. Caldwell's psychological evaluation suddenly made perfect sense, as the behavioral patterns she'd documented aligned with someone managing trauma acquired through betrayal at the highest levels of military command. The controlled responses and hypervigilance weren't civilian stress. They were survival mechanisms developed during classified operations. Master Chief Vance maintained his position of attention with the reverence reserved for personnel whose service had been written in blood and sealed with sacrifice. His 3 decades of experience provided enough context to understand when he was witnessing the restoration of honor to someone whose reputation had been destroyed by forces beyond their control. Seaman Davis stood transfixed as legend transformed into reality before his eyes. The Phoenix stories he'd heard during training suddenly embodied in the woman who'd been cleaning tables around him for months without recognition or acknowledgement. "The arms-dealing charges were substantiated," Commander Cross continued, his voice carrying details that painted a picture of corruption that had reached the highest levels of military command. "Thorne was selling classified information and weapons to hostile forces, using your team as cover for operations that served his personal enrichment rather than national security. The betrayal had been comprehensive and devastating, extending far beyond the single mission that had destroyed Seren's life. Colonel Marcus Thorne had spent years building a network that used classified operations to facilitate illegal arms trades with enemies of the state, sacrificing personnel who trusted him completely to protect his criminal enterprise. Operation Shadowfall was designed from the beginning as a sacrifice mission," Commander Cross revealed, his words carrying weight that made the remaining personnel understand the magnitude of conspiracy they were witnessing. "Your team was sent into hostile territory with compromised intelligence, deliberately exposed to enemy forces as part of Thorne's arrangement with arms dealers who needed American casualties to justify increased weapons sales." The revelation painted a picture of betrayal so comprehensive that it redefined understanding of everything Seren had endured during 24 months of exile and disgrace. She hadn't just survived a mission gone wrong, she'd survived deliberate sacrifice, orchestrated by the mentor she'd trusted most completely. Knox's weapons specialist training provided enough context to understand that arms-dealing conspiracies involving senior officers represented threats to national security that went far beyond individual misconduct. The implications reached into classified territory that could affect ongoing operations worldwide. 6 operators died because Thorne needed casualties to maintain credibility with his criminal network, Commander Cross continued, his voice carrying anger that had been building for months while evidence was gathered and conspiracies were unraveled. You survived because your capabilities exceeded his expectations and his ability to control outcomes through manipulation of intelligence and resources. The words hit Seren like physical blows, reshaping her understanding of trauma she'd carried for 24 months, while believing herself responsible for failures that had been orchestrated by forces beyond her control. The survivor guilt that had driven her into exile suddenly appeared in a different context. She'd been carrying responsibility for crimes committed against her rather than failures of her own making. Braxton stood frozen in comprehension of the magnitude of his error, his harassment campaign against a war hero, suddenly visible as the career-ending mistake Knox had recognized it to be. His confident aggression had dissolved into pale recognition that he'd just destroyed his own future through ignorance and arrogance that had prevented him from recognizing honor when it stood directly before him. When military personnel face legal challenges, specialized consultation services understanding military law become essential. Professional training programs and legal protection ensure service members receive expert guidance through complex career transitions. The recording of his confession is being played for congressional oversight committees as we speak, Commander Cross announced, producing a small digital device that contained evidence powerful enough to reshape understanding of classified operations and congressional funding for military programs. He activated the device, filling the mess hall with the voice of Colonel Marcus Thorne, as recorded during interrogation sessions that had finally broken through decades of carefully constructed deception and criminal conspiracy. Thorne's voice carried the arrogance of someone who'd believed himself untouchable, protected by classification levels that made investigation impossible and accountability optional. Phoenix was the perfect fall guy, his recorded voice explained, with casual indifference to human cost. Capable enough to complete the mission, expendable enough to take the blame when political necessity required sacrifice. The recording continued with details that painted a comprehensive picture of betrayal extending far beyond Operation Shadowfall into a network of criminal activity that had used classified operations to facilitate arms dealing with hostile forces worldwide. I needed casualties to maintain credibility with my buyers. Thorne's voice continued without emotion or recognition of the lives he'd deliberately destroyed. Phoenix team was selected because their capabilities would generate maximum casualties, while their classification level would prevent investigation or exposure of my arrangements. Knox listened to the confession with growing recognition of the magnitude of conspiracy that had destroyed Seren's career and reputation. The weapons specialist training that had made him suspicious of her capabilities now provided context for understanding how those same capabilities had made her a target for elimination by forces operating within military command structure. Dr. Caldwell documented the psychological impact of vindication on someone who'd spent 24 months carrying responsibility for crimes committed against her. The transformation from trauma survivor to vindicated hero was occurring in real time, as evidence emerged that redefined everything she'd believed about her own history and responsibility. Master Chief Vance stood at attention with the bearing of someone witnessing justice delivered to personnel whose sacrifice had been hidden by classification and conspiracy. His 3 decades of service provided enough context to understand when honor was being restored to someone whose reputation had been destroyed by forces beyond their control. Seaman Davis watched with fascination as legend aligned with reality. The Phoenix stories he'd heard during training suddenly embodied in someone whose vindication was reshaping his understanding of honor and sacrifice in military service. The evidence includes financial records, communication intercepts, and testimony from surviving members of Thorne's criminal network, Commander Cross announced, providing details that painted a comprehensive picture of conspiracy reaching far beyond individual misconduct into systemic corruption that had affected classified operations worldwide. The vindication was complete and overwhelming. 24 months of disgrace and exile suddenly revealed as the product of criminal conspiracy rather than individual failure. Seren's survival and sacrifice had been genuine, while Thorne's accusations and evidence had been manufactured to protect criminal operations that had used classified military resources for personal enrichment. Braxton's career-ending error was becoming visible in real time, as the magnitude of his harassment campaign against a vindicated war hero reached levels that would require explanation to congressional committees and military oversight organizations investigating the Thorne conspiracy. Knox's weapons specialist suspicions had been vindicated in ways that exceeded his original concerns about security and capability. The woman he'd investigated possessed classification levels and operational experience that went far beyond routine civilian contractor databases, because she'd been operating in classified territory that officially didn't exist. Your Medal of Valor is being restored along with all honors and recognition that were stripped during the court-martial, Commander Cross announced, producing documents that represented official acknowledgement of service that had been hidden by conspiracy and criminal manipulation of military justice systems. The restoration was comprehensive, including back pay, benefits, and recognition that had been denied through manufactured evidence and perjured testimony. Seren's reputation was being rebuilt through congressional action that represented acknowledgement of sacrifice that had been hidden by classification and conspiracy. "There's more," Commander Cross continued, his expression suggesting developments that went beyond simple vindication into territory that could reshape her future and relationship with military service. "The Ghost Unit 7 designation has been reactivated with authorization for operations that require your specific capabilities and experience." The offer represented an opportunity to return to classified operations that had defined her identity before Thorne's betrayal had forced her into exile and anonymity. But it also represented choices between revenge and healing, between returning to service that had nearly destroyed her and finding peace that had eluded her for 24 months. Knox watched the offer with understanding that it represented validation of everything his weapons specialist training had detected about capabilities that went far beyond civilian contractor classifications. The woman who had been cleaning tables possessed skills that remained relevant to operations most people would never know existed. Dr. Caldwell documented the psychological complexity of choices between vindication and peace, between returning to service that had caused trauma and finding healing that might require walking away from identity and purpose that had defined her entire adult life. Master Chief Vance recognized the significance of reactivation offers that represented acknowledgement of capabilities that remained relevant to national security concerns requiring the highest levels of classification and operational experience. Seaman Davis understood that he was witnessing decisions that would reshape lives and possibly affect operations that extended far beyond individual career choices into classified territory that required capabilities few people possessed. The mess hall had become a crucible for forces that went far beyond routine personnel decisions into classified territory that could affect national security and congressional oversight of military operations worldwide. Seren stood at the center of choices that would determine her future relationship with service that had defined and nearly destroyed her. 24 months of exile and anonymity had ended with vindication that exceeded her expectations and offers that could reshape her relationship with military service. But vindication required choices between revenge against those who'd wronged her and healing that might require walking away from identity and purpose that had survived betrayal and conspiracy. The dog tag around her neck no longer represented revoked access and disgrace, but restored honor and opportunity to return to operations that remained classified and essential. The angular diamond tattoo on her chest marked her as belonging to units that continued to operate in shadow spaces where conventional military operations couldn't reach. Commander Cross waited for her response with patience that suggested understanding of the magnitude of choices she was facing. Vindication represented opportunity, but also responsibility for decisions that could affect operations, extending far beyond individual career concerns into classified territory that required capabilities few people possessed. The choice between revenge and healing would determine not just her future, but the future of operations that depended on personnel whose capabilities had been tested through betrayal and survival that most people couldn't imagine. Honor had been restored, but purpose remained to be determined through choices that would reshape her relationship with service that had defined her identity. Seren looked around the mess hall that had been her prison and sanctuary for 24 months, seeing familiar spaces transformed by recognition that changed everything about her relationship with military service and personal identity. The decision she made would affect not just her future, but the future of personnel, whose capabilities remained essential to operations most people would never know existed. "I need time," she said finally, her voice carrying undertones that suggested the magnitude of choices she was facing required consideration that went beyond immediate response to vindication and opportunity. Commander Cross nodded with understanding that suggested experience with personnel facing choices between service and healing, between returning to operations that had caused trauma and finding peace that might require walking away from identity that had survived betrayal and conspiracy. "You have 72 hours, he said, providing a timeline that balanced operational necessity with personal consideration for someone whose service had been validated through evidence that exceeded original expectations and requirements. But the peaceful moment of decision was interrupted by the electronic chime of an encrypted communication device that Commander Cross wore for classified purposes that required immediate attention, regardless of other considerations or ongoing personnel decisions. He checked the device with expression that shifted from understanding to urgency as classified information reached him through channels that suggested developments requiring immediate attention and possible operational response from personnel whose capabilities remained essential to national security concerns. "Phoenix," he said, his voice carrying new urgency that suggested developments that could affect the choices she was considering. "We have a situation that may require immediate consultation, regardless of your decision about reactivation and return to classified operations." The encrypted communication contained intelligence about operations that remained classified but affected national security concerns that could require capabilities she possessed, regardless of her personal decisions about future military service and relationship with units that operated in classified territory. Seren recognized the tone and implications of classified emergencies that could override personal considerations when national security concerns required immediate consultation from personnel whose experience remained relevant to ongoing operations worldwide. "What kind of situation?" she asked, her training automatically engaging despite personal considerations that had been paramount moments earlier. Commander Cross glanced around the mess hall, evaluating security concerns and classification levels that required careful consideration before sharing information that could affect ongoing operations and personnel whose safety depended on maintaining operational security. "We've identified 12 additional personnel who were targeted by Thorne's network," he revealed, providing information that suggested the conspiracy extended far beyond Operation Shadowfall into systematic targeting of personnel whose capabilities threatened criminal operations that had infiltrated military command structures. The revelation expanded the scope of conspiracy beyond individual betrayal into systematic elimination of personnel whose capabilities and integrity threatened criminal networks that had used military resources and classification levels to protect illegal operations worldwide. Knox's weapons specialist training provided enough context to understand that systematic targeting of elite personnel represented threats to national security that went far beyond individual misconduct into organized criminal activity that could affect operational capabilities worldwide. Dr. Skur Caldwell recognized the psychological implications of systematic targeting that suggested conspiracy reaching levels that could affect her own safety and the safety of personnel whose capabilities made them targets for elimination by criminal networks operating within military command structures. Master Chief Vance understood that systematic targeting of elite personnel represented existential threats to operational capabilities that could affect national security concerns, requiring immediate attention and possible intervention from personnel whose experience remained relevant to classified operations. Seaman Davis realized that he was witnessing the emergence of threats that could affect his own future service and the future of personnel whose capabilities remained essential to operations that most people would never understand or acknowledge. 12 personnel with capabilities similar to yours have been identified as targets for elimination through manufactured evidence and orchestrated mission failures designed to remove them from operational status, Commander Cross continued, providing details that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic conspiracy that extended far beyond individual cases into organized criminal activity. The targeting had been comprehensive and sophisticated, using classification levels and military justice systems to eliminate personnel whose capabilities and integrity threatened criminal operations that had infiltrated the highest levels of military command structure worldwide. Some have already been eliminated through missions designed to ensure casualties, Commander Cross revealed. His voice carrying anger that had been building as evidence emerged of systematic murder, disguised as operational casualties and mission failures. The revelation transformed Vindication into something larger and more urgent, suggesting that her survival and capabilities remained essential to exposing and stopping criminal operations that continued to target personnel whose integrity threatened organized criminal activity within military command structures. Seren felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had driven her through impossible missions and sustained her through 24 months of exile and disgrace. The choice between healing and service was becoming more complex as evidence emerged of ongoing threats to personnel whose capabilities remained essential to national security. "Where are they?" she asked, her voice carrying undertones that suggested operational thinking was automatically engaging, despite personal considerations that had been paramount moments earlier. "Scattered across classified operations worldwide," Commander Cross responded, providing information that suggested the scope of rescue and protection operations that would require capabilities few people possessed and classification levels that most personnel would never achieve. The response transformed personal choice into operational necessity as evidence emerged that her capabilities remained essential to protecting personnel whose survival could determine the outcome of classified operations that affected national security concerns worldwide. Knox recognized that he was witnessing the emergence of operational requirements that would test capabilities he'd only begun to understand through weapons specialist training that provided limited context for classified operations that required elite personnel whose experience exceeded conventional military training. Dr. Caldwell documented the psychological transformation from personal choice to operational necessity as evidence emerged of systematic targeting that made individual decisions about service and healing irrelevant compared to immediate threats facing personnel whose capabilities remained essential to national security. Master Chief Vance understood that systematic targeting of elite personnel required a response that could only be provided by personnel whose capabilities and experience exceeded conventional military training and operational classification levels. Seaman Davis watched the emergence of operational necessity that transformed personal choice into a classified emergency, requiring immediate attention from personnel whose capabilities he was only beginning to understand through observation of legendary operations and personnel. The encrypted communication device chimed again with additional intelligence that suggested developments requiring immediate attention and possible operational response from personnel whose capabilities remained essential to addressing threats that could affect national security concerns worldwide. Commander Cross checked the new information with expression that shifted from urgency to alarm as classified intelligence revealed developments that exceeded original estimates of threat level and operational requirements for addressing criminal networks that had infiltrated military command structures. "We have immediate actionable intelligence about the planned elimination of 3 additional personnel within the next 48 hours, he announced, providing information that transformed personal choice into an operational emergency requiring immediate response from personnel whose capabilities remained essential to preventing systematic murder disguised as mission casualties. The timeline eliminated consideration periods and transformed personal choice into operational necessity, as evidence emerged of immediate threats that could only be addressed by personnel whose capabilities and experience exceeded conventional military training and classification levels. Saren felt 24 months of exile and personal consideration dissolving under the weight of operational necessity that required capabilities she possessed, regardless of personal decisions about future service and relationship with military operations that had nearly destroyed her. "I'm in," she said simply, her voice carrying undertones that suggested operational thinking had overridden personal considerations when faced with immediate threats to personnel whose survival could determine outcomes of classified operations affecting national security. The decision transformed her from vindicated victim to operational asset as circumstances required capabilities that had survived betrayal and conspiracy to address threats that could affect the survival of personnel whose integrity remained essential to national security concerns. Commander Cross nodded, with recognition that suggested experience with personnel whose capabilities made personal choice irrelevant when faced with operational necessity that required immediate response from elite personnel whose experience exceeded conventional military training. The encrypted device chimed with operational coordinates and classified mission parameters that would require capabilities few people possessed and classification levels that most personnel would never achieve or understand. Transport leaves in 30 minutes, Commander Cross announced, providing a timeline that balanced operational necessity with minimal preparation time for personnel whose capabilities remained essential to addressing immediate threats to national security. But the departure was interrupted by final confrontations that required resolution before operational deployment could begin. Braxton remained frozen in comprehension of career-ending errors that had been documented by multiple witnesses and recorded by devices that would ensure congressional oversight of his conduct and future military service. Knox stepped forward with understanding that his weapons specialist training had provided context for recognizing capabilities that exceeded his original security concerns and evolved into respect for personnel whose service had been validated through evidence that exceeded his expectations. "Ma'am," Knox said formally, his voice carrying recognition and respect that replaced the suspicious investigation that had helped expose her identity. "It's been an honor." The acknowledgement represented transformation from suspicious investigator to respectful colleague as understanding emerged of capabilities and sacrifice that exceeded his weapons specialist training and classification level. "Doctor," Caldwell approached with professional recognition that her psychological evaluation had documented someone whose capabilities and experience exceeded civilian consultation and evolved into classified territory that required expertise beyond her civilian status and clearance level. "I'll ensure the documentation supports your vindication and service record," she said professionally, providing assurance that psychological evaluation would support rather than complicate her restored status and future operational assignments. Master Chief Vance stepped forward with the bearing of someone whose 3 decades of service had prepared him for moments when honor was restored to personnel whose sacrifice had been hidden by conspiracy and criminal manipulation of military justice systems. "Welcome back, Phoenix," he said formally, his voice carrying recognition and respect that represented acknowledgement from senior personnel whose experience provided context for understanding legendary service that had been validated through evidence and congressional oversight. Seaman Davis approached with the wide-eyed respect of someone whose idealism had been validated through witnessing the restoration of honor to personnel whose legendary service had been confirmed through evidence that exceeded his expectations and understanding. "Thank you for your service," he said simply, his voice carrying sincerity that represented the best of military values and recognition of sacrifice that had been hidden by classification and conspiracy. But Braxton remained frozen in place, his career-ending harassment campaign against a vindicated war hero documented through multiple witnesses and recorded evidence that would require explanation to congressional oversight committees investigating systematic conspiracy and criminal activity within military command structures. Seren looked at him with expression that suggested consideration of responses that could range from professional restraint to personal revenge for harassment that had added unnecessary pain to 24 months of exile and disgrace that had been manufactured through criminal conspiracy. "Petty Officer Steele," she said formally, her voice carrying authority that made it clear why she'd once been considered among the most elite operators in Special Forces history. Braxton managed to meet her eyes despite pale recognition that his future military service depended on her response to harassment that had been documented by multiple witnesses and recorded by devices that had captured his career-ending mistakes. "You have potential," she said finally, her voice carrying an understanding that suggested recognition of youth and inexperience that could be addressed through proper training and leadership rather than career-ending punishment that would serve no constructive purpose. The response represented a choice of healing over revenge, professional restraint over personal satisfaction, and recognition that his mistakes had been products of inexperience and poor leadership rather than malicious intent that required permanent consequences. "Use it wisely," she continued, providing guidance that suggested understanding of military values and professional development that could transform career-ending mistakes into learning experiences that could improve his future service and relationship with personnel whose capabilities exceeded his current understanding. The guidance represented the kind of leadership that had made her legendary among personnel whose experience provided context for understanding how elite capabilities could be used to develop, rather than destroy personnel whose potential remained relevant to military service and national security concerns. Braxton nodded with understanding that suggested recognition of opportunity for redemption and professional development that could transform his career-ending mistakes into learning experiences that would improve his future service and relationship with personnel whose capabilities he was only beginning to understand. The resolution represented a choice of healing over revenge that demonstrated the leadership qualities and professional values that had made her legendary among personnel whose experience provided context for understanding how true honor responded to challenges and opportunities for developing military personnel. Commander Cross approached with classified mission parameters that required immediate attention and operational deployment from personnel, whose capabilities remained essential to addressing threats that could affect the survival of personnel and national security concerns worldwide. "Ready?" he asked, providing a final opportunity for consideration before operational deployment that would return her to classified operations and units that had defined her identity before conspiracy and betrayal had forced her into exile and anonymity. Seren looked around the mess hall that had been her sanctuary and prison for 24 months, seeing familiar spaces transformed by recognition and vindication that had restored honor and opportunity to return to service that had defined her identity and purpose. "I'm ready," she said simply, her voice carrying undertones that suggested operational thinking and professional commitment that had survived betrayal and conspiracy to emerge stronger and more focused than circumstances that had nearly destroyed her. The response marked transformation from exiled victim to operational asset as classified emergency, required capabilities that had been tested through survival and vindication that exceeded original expectations and provided context for understanding how true honor responded to betrayal and opportunity. They moved toward the exit together, Commander Cross and the legendary Silver Phoenix, heading toward classified operations that would require capabilities few people possessed, an experience that had been validated through evidence and congressional oversight that provided context for understanding legendary service. But their departure was interrupted by the electronic chime of an encrypted communication that suggested additional developments requiring immediate attention and possible modification of operational parameters that had been established based on intelligence that was apparently evolving in real time. Commander Cross checked the device with expression that shifted from operational focus to something approaching surprise as new intelligence reached him through channels that suggested developments that could affect the classified mission parameters and operational requirements they had been discussing. "Phoenix," he said, his voice carrying new information that suggested developments that could affect their operational deployment and mission parameters. "We just received confirmation that Colonel Thorne escaped federal custody 47 minutes ago. The revelation transformed operational parameters from rescue mission to active threat response, as evidence emerged that the criminal conspiracy continued to pose immediate threats to personnel whose survival remained essential to national security concerns and ongoing classified operations worldwide." Seren felt familiar operational thinking, as circumstances required capabilities that had survived betrayal and conspiracy to address immediate threats from the mentor whose criminal activity had destroyed her life and forced her into 24 months of exile and disgrace. The choice between healing and revenge was being made for her by circumstances that required operational response to immediate threats from personnel whose criminal activity posed ongoing dangers to national security, and the survival of personnel whose capabilities remained essential to classified operations. "Where?" she asked, her voice carrying operational focus that automatically engaged when faced with immediate threats that could only be addressed through capabilities and experience that had been tested through survival and vindication. "Unknown," Commander Cross responded, providing information that suggested the scope of threat assessment and operational requirements that would be necessary to locate and address criminal activity that posed immediate dangers to national security and personnel whose survival remained essential to ongoing operations. The response transformed their operational deployment from structured mission to active threat assessment, requiring capabilities that could adapt to changing circumstances and unknown variables that could affect the outcome of operations, essential to national security and personnel safety. But we have his communication intercepts suggesting planned retaliation against personnel who testified against him, Commander Cross continued, providing intelligence that suggested immediate threats to personnel whose safety depended on operational response from elite personnel whose capabilities had been validated through evidence and congressional oversight. The intelligence painted a picture of immediate danger that required operational response from personnel whose experience and capabilities could address threats that exceeded conventional security measures and required classification levels that most personnel would never achieve. Saren recognized the operational parameters and threat assessment that required capabilities she possessed, regardless of personal considerations about future service and relationship with military operations that had nearly destroyed her through conspiracy and betrayal. "I'm in," she said again, her voice carrying operational commitment that had survived 24 months of exile and emerged stronger and more focused through vindication and evidence that had restored honor and purpose to service that had been hidden by criminal conspiracy. The encrypted communication device chimed with final operational parameters and classified mission requirements that would take them into territory that required capabilities few people possessed, an experience that had been tested through betrayal and survival that exceeded conventional military training. "Transport leaves now," Commander Cross announced, providing a timeline that eliminated remaining consideration and transformed personal choice into operational necessity, as classified emergencies required immediate response from personnel whose capabilities remained essential to national security. They moved toward the exit with operational focus that had been tested through survival and vindication, heading toward classified operations that would determine the outcome of criminal conspiracy that had affected personnel and national security concerns, extending far beyond individual cases into systematic threats that required elite capabilities. The mess hall returned to routine operation as they departed, but the personnel who remained understood that they had witnessed the emergence of legendary capabilities from exile and anonymity into operational necessity that would affect classified operations and national security concerns they would never fully understand. 24 months of exile had ended with vindication that exceeded expectations and operational deployment that would test capabilities through circumstances that could determine the outcome of criminal conspiracy and threats that affected personnel and national security concerns worldwide. The ghost known as Silver Phoenix had emerged from the shadows to reclaim her rightful place in operations that required capabilities few people possessed, an experience that had been validated through evidence that would reshape understanding of honor and sacrifice in military service. As they reached the exit, Saren's encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming call that displayed symbols she recognized from operations that existed in the classified margins of national security. The caller identification showed clearance levels that exceeded even Ghost Unit classifications. "Phoenix," a voice said as she answered, carrying authority that suggested operations that went beyond individual mission parameters into classified territory that affected global security concerns. "We have another situation that requires your immediate consultation." The call represented expansion of operational requirements beyond single mission parameters into classified territory that could affect global security and require capabilities that had been tested through betrayal and vindication that exceeded original expectations and operational requirements. Multiple classified facilities worldwide have been compromised through systematic infiltration that appears connected to Thorne's network, the voice continued, providing intelligence that suggested the scope of criminal conspiracy exceeded individual cases and extended into global security threats that required immediate attention. The revelation transformed their immediate operational deployment into global security concerns that could affect classified facilities and personnel worldwide, requiring capabilities that exceeded conventional military responses and demanded classification levels that most personnel would never achieve. "How many facilities?" Saren asked, her operational thinking automatically engaging, as circumstances required capabilities that could address threats that exceeded individual mission parameters and extended into global security concerns. 17 confirmed, with evidence suggesting additional compromises that haven't been detected through conventional security measures, the voice responded, providing intelligence that painted a comprehensive picture of global security threats that required immediate attention from personnel whose capabilities exceeded conventional military training. The scope of compromise suggested systematic infiltration that could affect global security concerns and require operational response from personnel whose experience and capabilities had been validated through evidence that exceeded original expectations and congressional oversight. Commander Cross listened to the conversation with understanding that their operational deployment was expanding beyond single mission parameters into global security concerns that would require capabilities and classification levels that exceeded conventional military responses to criminal conspiracy. "We're en route," Seren said finally, her voice carrying operational commitment that had survived 24 months of exile to emerge stronger and more focused through vindication and evidence that had restored purpose to service that remained essential to global security concerns. The encrypted call ended with operational coordinates that would take them beyond single mission parameters into classified territory that could affect global security and require capabilities that few people possessed, an experience that had been tested through betrayal and survival. As they reached the transport vehicle, Seren looked back at the mess hall that had been her sanctuary and prison for 24 months, understanding that her exile had ended not with peaceful resolution, but with operational necessity that would test capabilities through circumstances that exceeded her original expectations. The dog tag around her neck had been reactivated with clearance levels that exceeded her previous classifications, marking her return to operations that existed in classified margins of global security where conventional military responses couldn't reach. The angular diamond tattoo on her chest marked her as belonging to units that operated beyond conventional boundaries, in shadow spaces where honor and sacrifice were measured through capabilities that most people would never understand or acknowledge. 24 months of exile had prepared her for operations that would require everything she'd learned through betrayal and survival, testing capabilities that had been forged through circumstances that exceeded conventional military training and operational experience. The transport pulled away from Coronado Naval Base as dawn broke over the Pacific, carrying legendary capabilities toward classified operations that would determine the outcome of global security threats that affected personnel and national security concerns extending far beyond individual cases. The ghost stories personnel would tell about Silver Phoenix had just begun, but the legend herself was focused on operational reality that required capabilities tested through betrayal and vindicated through evidence that had restored honor to service that remained essential to global security. Some ghosts were meant to haunt the guilty, and the guilty were about to discover that exile had only made the Phoenix stronger, more focused, and absolutely determined to protect personnel whose capabilities remained essential to operations that existed in the classified margins, where legends were born and honor was measured through sacrifice that few would ever understand. The countdown that had begun with Braxton's mockery had ended with operational deployment that would reshape global security and test capabilities through circumstances that would define the future of classified operations and personnel whose honor had been validated through evidence that exceeded all expectations. In the shadow spaces where conventional rules didn't apply, Silver Phoenix had work to do. The transport vehicle cut through pre-dawn darkness with urgency that matched the classified emergency unfolding across multiple continents. Seren sat in tactical silence as encrypted communications flooded in from operational theaters that most people would never know existed, painting a comprehensive picture of systematic infiltration that threatened global security infrastructure. Commander Cross monitored incoming intelligence with expression that shifted from concern to alarm as the scope of Thorne's criminal network became visible through evidence that exceeded original estimates of conspiracy and criminal activity within military command structures worldwide. The 17 compromised facilities include 3 weapons research installations, 4 communication centers, 6 classified training operations, 2 nuclear security stations, and 2 installations we can't discuss without security clearances that don't officially exist, Commander Cross reported, his voice carrying weight that suggested threats to national security that exceeded conventional emergency response capabilities. The scope painted a picture of systematic infiltration that had been years in development, using classification levels and military access to compromise facilities that contained technology and information essential to global security and defense capabilities that protected civilian populations worldwide. Seren processed the intelligence with operational thinking that automatically categorized threats by priority level and response requirements, her experience providing context for understanding how systematic infiltration could affect operational capabilities and global security concerns that exceeded individual facility compromise. Timeline for total compromise, she asked, her voice carrying operational focus that had been tested through circumstances that exceeded conventional military training and survival experience. Unknown, but intercepted communications suggest coordinated activation of infiltrated assets within 72 hours, Commander Cross responded, providing intelligence that suggested an immediate timeline for threats that could affect global security and require operational response from personnel whose capabilities exceeded conventional military training. The timeline eliminated extended planning and required immediate operational response from personnel whose experience and capabilities could address multiple simultaneous threats that exceeded conventional security measures and required classification levels that most personnel would never achieve. Her encrypted phone buzzed with additional intelligence that suggested developments requiring immediate attention and possible modification of operational parameters that had been established based on information that was apparently evolving faster than original intelligence estimates. Phoenix, we have confirmation that Thorn's network includes foreign intelligence services and criminal organizations that have been using compromised military facilities to access classified technology and information for sale to hostile nations, the voice reported, providing intelligence that expanded the scope of threats beyond criminal conspiracy into international espionage and terrorism that could affect global security. The revelation transformed their operational deployment from domestic criminal investigation into an international security emergency that could affect relationships between allied nations and require diplomatic coordination beyond conventional military operational parameters. Which foreign services? Seren asked, her training automatically engaging threat assessment protocols that had been developed through operations in classified theaters where conventional military responses couldn't address threats that required elite capabilities and classification levels. Confirmed involvement from 3 nations currently classified as strategic competitors, with evidence suggesting additional participation from organizations that operate beyond official government control, the voice responded, providing intelligence that painted a comprehensive picture of international conspiracy that exceeded individual criminal activity. The scope suggested systematic infiltration that had been coordinated across multiple nations and criminal organizations, using Thorn's network as foundation for operations that could affect global security and require responses that exceeded conventional military capabilities and diplomatic protocols. Commander Cross listened to the expanding intelligence with understanding that their operational deployment was evolving into an international emergency that would require capabilities and coordination that exceeded conventional military responses to criminal conspiracy and espionage threats. Assets in position for immediate response? Seren asked, her operational thinking automatically engaging resource assessment that had been developed through operations where success depended on accurate evaluation of available capabilities and support infrastructure. Ghost unit assets have been activated worldwide with authorization for operations that exceed conventional parameters, the voice responded, providing confirmation that elite capabilities were being deployed to address threats that required classification levels and operational experience that most personnel would never achieve. The authorization represented acknowledgement that conventional military responses couldn't address threats that required capabilities and experience that had been tested through operations in classified theaters where conventional rules and limitations didn't apply to personnel whose survival depended on exceeding normal operational parameters. As their transport approached the airfield, Seren could see aircraft that didn't appear in any official military inventory, vehicles designed for operations that required capabilities and stealth technology that exceeded conventional military transportation and operational deployment requirements. The site confirmed that their deployment was entering classified territory that operated beyond conventional military parameters, where personnel and technology existed in shadow spaces that provided capabilities essential to addressing threats that couldn't be resolved through official channels and conventional responses. Commander Cross activated encrypted communication systems that connected them to operational centers worldwide, creating coordination capability that allowed real-time intelligence sharing and operational planning across multiple continents and classified facilities that operated beyond conventional military command structures. Global deployment is synchronized with your operational timeline, he announced, providing confirmation that elite personnel worldwide were being deployed simultaneously to address multiple threats that required coordinated response from capabilities that exceeded conventional military training and operational experience. The coordination represented operational capability that had been developed through years of classified operations and personnel, whose experience provided the foundation for addressing threats that required elite capabilities and classification levels that most people would never understand or acknowledge. As they boarded the aircraft, Seren felt familiar operational focus engaging automatically, her mind shifting into patterns that had been developed through survival in circumstances that exceeded conventional military training and operational experience. The 24 months of exile had ended, but the capabilities forged through betrayal and vindication remained stronger and more focused than circumstances that had nearly destroyed her. The aircraft lifted off with urgency that matched classified emergencies unfolding across multiple continents, carrying legendary capabilities toward operations that would test everything she'd learned through survival and vindication that had exceeded original expectations and congressional oversight of military service and sacrifice. During flight, encrypted communications provided continuous updates on developing situations at compromised facilities worldwide, painting a real-time picture of threats that were evolving faster than conventional security responses could address through official channels and established protocols. Facility 7 has gone dark, Commander Cross reported, his voice carrying concern that suggested loss of communication represented an immediate threat to personnel and classified operations that could affect global security and national defense capabilities. Facility 12 reports unauthorized personnel accessing restricted areas with apparent knowledge of security protocols that should be known only to cleared personnel, he continued, providing intelligence that confirmed systematic infiltration had reached operational capability that exceeded original threat estimates. The reports painted a picture of coordinated attack on global security infrastructure that required immediate response from personnel whose capabilities and experience exceeded conventional military training and operational classification levels that most people would never achieve. ETA to primary target? Seren asked, her operational thinking automatically prioritizing threats by immediate danger to personnel and potential impact on global security concerns that required elite capabilities to address effectively. 47 minutes to Facility 1, where Thorn was last confirmed and where the primary computer systems contain access codes for all compromised installations worldwide, Commander Cross responded, providing operational parameters that suggested their first target contained intelligence essential to addressing systematic threats at all other locations. The primary target represented operational priority that could determine success or failure of global response to threats that exceeded conventional military capabilities and required coordination beyond normal operational parameters and classification levels. As they approached the target area, Seren could see a facility that didn't appear on any civilian maps, an installation that operated in classified territory, where conventional rules and oversight didn't apply to operations that required capabilities most people would never understand or acknowledge. The site confirmed that their operational deployment was entering shadow spaces where legendary capabilities would be tested through circumstances that exceeded conventional military training and required experience that had been validated through survival and vindication that exceeded original expectations. Target assessment complete, Commander Cross announced as reconnaissance data revealed facility status and threat evaluation that would determine operational approach and resource requirements for addressing immediate dangers to personnel and classified operations. The facility appears to be operating under hostile control with an unknown number of compromised personnel and potential civilian casualties that could affect operational parameters and rules of engagement, he continued, providing intelligence that complicated operational planning and required careful consideration of response that balanced immediate threat elimination with protection of innocent personnel. The assessment painted a picture of a complex operational environment that required capabilities and experience that could address multiple simultaneous threats while protecting personnel whose safety depended on precise execution of operations that exceeded conventional military training and classification levels. Seren reviewed operational parameters with focus that had been developed through circumstances where success depended on accurate threat assessment and resource evaluation that could determine survival of personnel and successful completion of missions that existed in classified margins of national security. Rules of engagement, she asked, her training automatically seeking clarification of operational constraints that would determine acceptable responses to threats and protection protocols for personnel whose safety remained priority despite classification levels that exceeded conventional military operational parameters. Authorized for whatever response is necessary to protect classified operations and personnel while neutralizing threats that exceed conventional security capabilities, Commander Cross responded, providing operational authority that exceeded normal rules of engagement and reflected the severity of threats that required elite capabilities. The authorization represented recognition that conventional military responses couldn't address threats that required capabilities and experience that operated beyond normal operational parameters and classification levels that most personnel would never achieve or understand. As their aircraft began descent toward the operational area, Seren felt a familiar transformation from civilian mindset to operational focus that had been tested through survival, in circumstances that exceeded conventional military training and experience. The capabilities forged through betrayal, and vindication remained stronger and more precise than circumstances that had nearly destroyed her identity and purpose. The facility appeared through early morning mist like a shadow from a nightmare, an installation that contained technology and information that could reshape global security if compromised through systematic infiltration that had been years in development and coordination through criminal networks that operated beyond conventional law enforcement capabilities. Secondary teams in position at other compromised facilities worldwide, Commander Cross confirmed, as final operational coordination was completed for synchronized response to threats that required elite capabilities and classification levels that exceeded conventional military operational parameters and international cooperation. The coordination represented operational capability that had been developed through years of classified operations and personnel whose experience provided the foundation for addressing threats that required global response from capabilities that most people would never understand or acknowledge. The landing approach revealed a facility that appeared to be operating under normal conditions, but intelligence suggested hostile control and systematic compromise that posed immediate threats to global security and classified operations that protected civilian populations and national defense capabilities worldwide. Visual confirmation of hostile personnel at primary entrance, Commander Cross reported, as reconnaissance revealed immediate threats that required operational response from capabilities that exceeded conventional security measures and required elite training and classification levels. The confirmation painted a picture of immediate operational necessity that would test capabilities through circumstances that could determine the outcome of global security threats and protection of personnel, whose safety depended on precise execution of operations that existed in classified margins. As they prepared for operational deployment, Seren felt 24 months of exile and vindication crystallizing into an operational focus that had been tested through survival in circumstances that exceeded conventional military training and experience. The ghost known as Silver Phoenix was about to remind hostile forces why legends earned their reputation through capabilities that operated beyond conventional limitations. Phoenix, you have authorization for independent operational authority, Commander Cross announced, providing recognition that her capabilities and experience exceeded conventional command structures and required operational freedom that matched the severity of threats they were addressing. The authorization represented acknowledgement that elite capabilities required operational parameters that exceeded conventional military command structures and reflected trust that had been earned through service that had been validated through evidence and congressional oversight that exceeded original expectations. Seren nodded with understanding that operational authority represented both opportunity and responsibility for success that would determine the outcome of global security threats and protection of personnel whose capabilities remained essential to classified operations that protected civilian populations and national defense infrastructure. "Let's finish this," she said simply, her voice carrying operational commitment that had survived 24 months of exile to emerge stronger and more focused through vindication and evidence that had restored purpose to service that remained essential to global security. The response marked transformation from vindicated victim to operational asset as classified emergency required capabilities that had been tested through betrayal and survival to address threats that exceeded conventional military responses and required classification levels that most personnel would never achieve. As they moved toward the facility, encrypted communications confirmed successful operational deployment at compromised installations worldwide, with Ghost Unit personnel engaging threats that required elite capabilities and coordination that exceeded conventional military operational parameters and international cooperation protocols. Global operations synchronized, Commander Cross confirmed, as real-time intelligence revealed successful engagement of threats at multiple facilities simultaneously, demonstrating operational coordination that had been developed through years of classified operations and personnel whose experience exceeded conventional military training. The synchronization represented operational success that validated capabilities and planning that had been tested through circumstances that exceeded normal operational parameters and required elite personnel whose experience provided the foundation for addressing global security threats. But their immediate operational focus was interrupted by encrypted communication that suggested developments requiring immediate attention and possible modification of operational parameters that had been established based on intelligence that was apparently evolving in real time as hostile forces responded to coordinated global deployment. Phoenix, we have intelligence that Thorn has activated final contingency protocols that could compromise classified operations beyond current threat estimates, the voice reported, providing information that suggested immediate escalation of threats that exceeded original operational planning and resource allocation. The intelligence painted a picture of an escalating threat that required immediate operational response from capabilities that could address developing situations that exceeded conventional military responses and required elite experience and classification levels that most personnel would never achieve. What kind of contingency? Seren asked, her operational thinking automatically engaging threat assessment that had been developed through experience in classified operations, where survival depended on accurate evaluation of developing threats and available response capabilities. Unknown, but preliminary intelligence suggests systematic activation of assets we haven't identified through conventional security measures, the voice responded, providing information that suggested threats that exceeded current intelligence and required operational response that could adapt to unknown variables and developing circumstances. The uncertainty represented an operational challenge that required capabilities and experience that could address threats that exceeded conventional planning and required adaptation to circumstances that couldn't be anticipated through normal operational preparation and intelligence gathering. As they approached the facility, Seren understood that their operational deployment was entering territory that would test everything she'd learned through survival and vindication, requiring capabilities that had been forged through circumstances that exceeded conventional military training and operational experience. The facility loomed before them like a monument to classified operations that existed in shadow spaces where conventional rules didn't apply to personnel whose capabilities and experience provided the foundation for addressing threats that protected civilian populations and global security infrastructure. In those shadow spaces, where honor was measured through sacrifice that few would understand and legends were forged through capabilities that exceeded human limitations, Silver Phoenix had work to do that would determine the outcome of threats that could reshape global security and test everything she'd learned through 24 months of exile and vindication. The countdown that had begun with mockery in a mess hall was reaching its final moments, and the world was about to discover that some legends never die. They just wait for the perfect moment to remind everyone why honor, sacrifice, and capabilities that exceed human limitations remain essential to protecting those who serve in silence and fight in shadow spaces where conventional heroes cannot reach. The ghost stories were about to become reality, and reality was about to remind hostile forces that betrayal only makes the Phoenix stronger, more focused, and absolutely determined to protect those who serve with honor in operations that exist beyond conventional understanding and acknowledgement. In the distance, dawn was breaking over a world that would never know how close it had come to systematic compromise. Protected by capabilities and sacrifice that operated in classified margins where legends were born, and honor was measured through service that exceeded all expectations and limitations. The work was just beginning, and Silver Phoenix had never been more ready to remind the world why some ghosts are meant to haunt the guilty, until justice is served and honor is restored to those who serve in shadow spaces where conventional rules cannot reach.
Every uniform is a person trying their best. See each other with respect. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to TNG Story.